Wow, this is like the biggest audience I've ever spoken in front of, so thank you so much for being here. It means a lot to me because this talk comes from a very personal space. So my name is Dora Militaru, and I work for the Financial Times, which is a global news organization, and I'm a web developer there. And my main passion is web performance. This is something I was interested in way before I became an engineer. And how this idea for a talk came to my mind is based on the experience I had for the first ever web performance meetup I went to, which was hosted by the Financial Times before I worked there. So I walked into the room, and the room was absolutely full. It was an incredible sight. And the English word for this is sausage fest, and you don't need a lot of imagination to understand what that means. I was the only woman in the room. And, yeah, okay, fair enough. If you're a man in the audience and you kind of try to step into my shoes for this one, so you're in a room, there's no one like you, and everybody seems like they know so much more than you do. And I felt so nervous, and I felt like all my questions were stupid, so I didn't ask any, and I couldn't really socialize because I am an introvert. So I probably missed out on a lot of really productive conversations that I got to have with time as I became part of the web performance community. Maybe you've never had an experience like this. Maybe, we don't have this perspective. So when my Argentinian friends think I'm being unreasonable, they go like, Dora, tipo. I love that. It's like, I am sharing this stage today with 5 badass women, engineers who have amazing talks, and our community has a lot of respect for. And, I got flown halfway around the world to be here on this stage, and I still get paid to write code. So there's a lot of people here listening to me. What is my problem? My problem is that I'm white, I'm young, I'm straight, I am a female, and I was born like that, and I'm a European citizen, and I don't have to show my key card to anyone when I enter my apartment building, and I didn't get asked to balance a binary search tree in immigration. They asked me for my hotel address. I totally failed at that. So I am living the dream, and the problem is that not everybody is as lucky as me, because today still someone's skin color, someone's gender, someone's religion, someone's disability, someone's geography and class and age can give them more or fewer opportunities for success. And some people have to work 10 times as hard to get to the same place in our industry. And I may be privileged, but I'm privileged enough to have the stage to talk to you today and about why this is, why it's harder for some of us, and how you and I can help. So, I'd like to tell you a story. This is a bit of a throwback to 2017, and Donald Trump is the new president of the United States. England decided to leave the European Union, and in my home country, which is Romania, millions of people have taken to the streets to protest against unspeakable corruption. So my future is looking a bit geographically uncertain. And this, in my head, is the perfect time to take a chance and change careers and finally get to write code for a living. So I was in equal parts happy and terrified when I got my first proper developer role, which was at the Financial Times. And I'd been coding for a while, and I love writing code. But when I joined, I realized I knew absolutely nothing. And then, about a month in, an internal memo written by a Google employee called James Damore was leaked, and it went viral. Among other things, Damore was arguing that because women are biologically and psychologically different from men, this explains why there are fewer female software engineers and why women are less likely to succeed in the industry. And I was already feeling like a fraud. So this memo and a lot of the internet discussion around it made me realize that the tech industry can be an unwelcoming place. And I'm fortunate, so what is it like for others? But every cloud has a silver lining, and because this memo was leaked, everyone started talking about diversity. It kind of highlighted how our industry is pretty homogeneous, and kind of exclusive, and it's like everyone found out overnight and started arguing about it very vocally and angrily and from all perspectives all over the internet. So I tuned into that conversation because I wanted to understand why we can't just all agree on something that will obviously make the world a better place, like fixing the imbalance in opportunity that we have in tech. And I started listening to all sides of the debate. And the first thing I noticed is that people talk about numbers a lot. So I'll start with the Financial Times, where I love working because we have a great culture. And my perception is that we value an environment where everyone feels safe. But when you look at the numbers, how diverse is the FT really? So globally, the FT employs slightly more women than men. At board level, female representation is 36%, which is well above the European average. And by 2022, the FT have committed to reaching gender parity in their senior leadership team. That means that all senior managers, 50-50. So like a lot of larger companies around the world, FT has something called diversity targets, and people have strong feelings about these targets or quotas, because there's an argument that they're anti-meritocratic, and it feels kind of random and unfair to have numerical requirements for hiring and promoting people based on things like gender or race. And I've read and I've heard many versions of, I was hired because I'm a token person, and worryingly I've heard enough accusations to the same tune, like, she was hired because she's a woman. And you see, this is a very, very difficult topic to discuss. But personally, I have two problems with diversity quotas. And the first one is that they can make it seem like fixing diversity is the problem of your talent or human resource department. It's like a side project and everybody else is absolved from every responsibility. And secondly, which I think is the biggest flaw, is that diversity quotas can trick us into thinking that our work is done once we've hit a target, like boom, here's the numbers, we fixed inequality, everyone's okay. It's not that simple. So let me give you an example. One of my favorite TV shows is Mad Men. It's a show about advertising. I used to work in advertising marketing. It's about ad agency called Sterling Cooper, and it's set in the late 50s, early 60s. And Sterling Cooper have gender parity. Every guy has a secretary. So you can't even take these statistics at face value, because you always have to ask extra questions to find out how the balance really tips. Like the most common thing you should ask is, what about the pay gap? So in the UK, 9 out of 10 women work for a company that pays them less for the same job. And half of men work for companies that pay them 10% or more for the same job. So don't make the mistake of thinking that enforcing diversity targets is enough to ensure fairness and equality, because it isn't. It's really important to recognize how quotas are flawed, but also ask yourself, like, do we today live in a society where privilege plays no part in opportunity? Today, does merit truly equal ability plus effort? I think the answer to both those questions is clearly no. And as long as that is true, diversity quotas remain necessary, but are obviously not sufficient, because they may be the only way of achieving a world where they're obsolete. So they're just a means to this end that we need. And you've noticed, I've done it on purpose, but we do tend to talk a lot about men and women and gender balances because we've spent thousands of years shaping and rationalizing gender roles, and that is what we know. But it's 2018 now, and the conversation needs to shift, because demographics are no longer binary. They're a spectrum. They have always been a spectrum. And if you argue about diversity along one dimension or another, it's fighting for a kind of diversity that benefits one group of people unequally over another, because it disregards the challenges that are, say, at the intersection of being a woman and a person with a disability, or a person of color and non-binary. And the kind of diversity we're fighting for is simply about more people from different races, cultures, walks of life, people of all abilities, and any, all or no gender, rubbing shoulder from venture capital meetings to fashion shows. And That's so that one day maybe working class kids won't have to get working class jobs, and more of us can lead lives free of discrimination and stigma. And the kind of diversity worth fighting for is this intersectional diversity. But how do you convince people to fight? Like, what is the battle cry that we hear most often? If you Google why is diversity important in tech, you'll come across a lot of articles, and they're all to the same tune, which is because it's good for business. And there's data from recent research from big consultancies like BCG and Deloitte that shows that diverse companies are more profitable, more productive, and more innovative. And the converse is also true. There's proof that a lack of diversity is bad for business. A study by McKinsey shows that companies with the least diverse leadership structures are 25% more likely to have financial returns below their industry medians, which is huge. So, yeah, statistics like these, they're great for getting executive buy-in for diversity initiatives. But to paraphrase a colleague of mine, it's good for business is also the line you give to people who are so uninterested in making the world better for anyone but themselves that it's good for business is all you have. And it's good for business has little influence over the opinions of a humble engineer. It's not my battle cry because it doesn't help much with actually fixing unfairness and inequality, and it doesn't help us build a diverse workplace or a diverse community from the ground up. And also, it's super boring because as someone outside of your company, I don't care if you need me or people like me to be better. Caring about diversity requires a moral argument that acknowledges inequity, because there is this systemic inequality in access to education and access to employment, and there are persistent stereotypes around race and gender and wealth and class, and our institutions, anything from education to politics, they come with unequal outcomes built in, which benefit some people more than others, and these are all just facts. So, if you think about it, diversity statistics are a good barometer for social justice and equality. And the more people begin to understand this in all its nuances, the better, and the better a chance for society and tech to change, because ignorance is part of the oppression. And who can argue with that? No one actually will. Okay, maybe like bad people, ignorant people, but we are good people here. And good people like you and me will acknowledge that diversity problem is perpetuated by injustice, and in turn it perpetuates injustice. And we're going to discuss this openly as an issue of social justice and equality and educate ourselves about what we can do better. Except sometimes people like you and me say and do things not for the intrinsic value of those things, but for what they say about us. And that's something called virtue signaling. It's a lot of what happens on social media, like Twitter, is virtue signaling, which is just showing off how right on you are. And to borrow a black political term, how woke you are. And there's a lot of this self-congratulating focus on diversity, and it usually comes from a position of privilege, and it's unhelpful. And it's sometimes so noisy that we don't notice that the progress we have made is not enough, and that our implementation may be slipping. So you really don't want to be naive and idealistic about this, because the space between caring and not giving a damn is in a follow-up. And purpose, having purpose, is not enough. You need more than that to create change. So you need to find your own reason to care about making our industry and our communities more inclusive, more welcoming for everyone. I had a bit of a light bulb moment. I framed things from a selfish perspective. What do I care about? So it's something most of us care about. It's enriching our own lives. But we don't live in a void. This richness comes from what's around us. It comes from gaining diversity of thought and experience. And this is something most of us aim for as individuals in our hunger for knowledge and the experiences we seek out, and through our aspirations in life and the people we connect with. And compared to everything else, we spent a lot of our time at work for a significant portion of our lives. And we come to trust our colleagues. We form these circles of almost implicit trust, and we start relying on one another to share ideas and make decisions and tackle problems and socialize. And we turn to our leaders for direction and advice, and we seek out their support, and we express gratitude when we receive it. And in turn, whenever possible, we offer our support to others, and we do this at work, we do this beyond work, and we give emotional support to the people we work with. We make friends, and we create inner circles. So in other words, we naturally create networks, informal social networks through which we diversify our knowledge, thought, and experience. And these types of informal networks are called cognitive social structures. Cognitive social structures have been widely studied since the 90s. Much like any other kind of network structures, we have established frameworks to analyze them. So I was reading about cognitive social structures and organizational network analysis, which is the field that looks at these structures within companies. And I came across an interesting study in Harvard Business Review. And it's underpinned by data, network data that came from surveying all employees of a large service provider. And the survey asked everyone questions like, with 1 day of training, whose job could you step into? Whom can you trust to discuss a work-related concern? Whom would you ask to support a proposal of yours that you fear might be unpopular? So all these questions, the answers were collated, the network data was processed, and the researchers mapped the connections between people onto directed graphs to represent various informal networks in the workplace. So there's not just one type of network, we'll get to that in a second. They also mapped binary gender onto all the vertices and edges. And this gave me an idea, so I decided to run a few simulations of what random informal networks might look like using the FT's senior leadership statistic of 64% gender split. So in a directed graph, all vertices, or nodes, have an in degree and an out degree, meaning the number of edges which are coming into, or respectively going out of that node. And the first thing I looked at was what would happen if, when the degrees of all vertices in these graphs were arranged in descending or ascending order. This is called a degree sequence. And the degree sequence of my first few random simulations told me nothing that surprised me too much, but I'm not going to ruin the surprise. I hope you can guess where this is going. So for argument's sake, let's just imagine that our senior leadership team here needs to make an important decision. And to make things simple, pick an orange node as the CTO and traverse the graph and ask yourself, how many women are likely to be involved in any given decision-making chain? And my findings echoed the study, way less women. And you're going to say, yeah, but that's obvious because there are fewer women than men. There's something else going on here. So I'll pick one of the other informal networks in the HBR study. The innovation or idea sharing network had 22% more ties between members of the same gender than we'd expect without giving any consideration to gender. And women are also less central than men, and they're completely absent from some areas, and they tend to have lower in degrees, which means they have fewer incoming ties. So what does this mean in plain English? It means that fewer people seek them out to discuss new ideas. So the hypothesis is that even if you have as many women as men, you will still have a disproportionate ratio of same gender ties, and that network will just not flow efficiently. Why is that? Because if diversity is bricks, then something called inclusion is mortar, and it turns out that we're, in our human nature, really awful at that for several reasons. Right? The first one is that we tend to gravitate towards people like us. This is called a similarity bias. It means that we instinctively hold back in building relationships with those who we perceive as the other, and that we judge the others more harshly, unconsciously. And we have a lot of these subtle biases and blind spots about people who are different from us. And these lead to exclusion and also self-exclusion, like not asking questions in a web performance meetup. And minority groups, they try to conform. It's often just to cope, but it can be to avoid being stereotyped, and they de-emphasize the otherness and adopt the traits and behaviors of the majority. If you've watched Suits, you will know, it's another TV show, sorry, I like TV shows. You will understand this dynamic in a law firm with high-powered female lawyers adopting lots of masculine behaviors. And this happens because our society portrays the majority as the prototype for success. And in doing so, we're effectively denying everybody else the right to belong. So if you're a minority, you're either going to get assimilated or excluded. Because when it comes to actively including others, the majority group puts up resistance, like naturally, because they perceive reverse favoritism and they feel excluded from diversity initiatives. So it's all like really awful, because underrepresented groups face a lot of bias. They have stereotype threat, they have ambition gaps within themselves, they have empathy gaps with others, and we're constantly bombarded with all these negative societal cues that we internalize, and that wears you down. So that's why for minorities, opportunity doesn't always translate into professional achievement. Your career progression depends on taking risks and advocating for yourself. And taking risks and advocating for yourself is kind of not at the forefront of your mind when you feel like you should just be grateful for being allowed a seat at the table, because being tolerated is a really long way off from feeling included. This is my favorite quote about the whole D&I debate. If diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being glad you're there. And I think that's really powerful. So, in other words, there's not much good in having diversity if this exists in isolation without inclusion. So this probably seems like an obvious point now, but diversity plus inclusion equals a happy, vibrant, welcoming developer community for all. But is that obvious to everyone in tech? This is my poorly drawn graph of the Stack Overflow Dev Survey this year, which, amongst many other questions, asked developers how they evaluate a potential job. And 30.4%, which is a vast majority for this question, said diversity was their lowest priority. Different types of developers have different priorities when considering jobs. So, for gender minorities, for example, company culture and office environment are the two highest ranking priorities. And the other 90% of respondents rank how much they're getting paid the highest. So we haven't even got the basics covered, right? The Stack Overflow Developer Survey made me sad, and I hope it's an eye-opener for you as well. But before we all emigrate to the moon, I'm going to try and answer the obvious question, which is how. How are we going to take down these barriers that stand in the way of a truly diverse and inclusive tech industry? We can start by admitting that there are things in our power that we should be doing. We can acknowledge our collective and individual responsibility to make things better. But there's no magic wand or quick fix, and I'll try to find a few things that you can do right now. First of all, do no harm. Just be kinder, more compassionate, stop and think before you talk and act. And I added this slide very last minute. 2 weeks ago, I was debating whether to tell you the story or not, so anyway, here it comes. 2 weeks ago, I was at a conference. I was in the audience. I struck up a conversation immediately in the break with a person on my right, and we were discussing, I can't remember, something like priority hints, something like that. And the person to the left of me, who had been sitting there for the past 2 talks, interrupts and says, "Oh, I didn't realize you're a developer. You don't look like a developer." And I'm just like, okay, what do I say to that? That's a weird assumption to make. Do no harm starts with toning down these microaggressions and not like putting people in awkward positions. And to do no harm, you have to start by understanding your own bias, because we're all biased. This person next to me had a cultural bias about how female developers look, or how developers look, I don't know. You need to size up that privilege and you need to keep it in check. And that's kind of hard to do because it's not easy and it's not obvious, and understanding bias, checking privilege, it requires a lot of introspection, and that's hard, and honesty, which is even harder. And research, which is mostly on the internet for free. And then you gotta hire people who care about making the world a better place, and they care about diversity and inclusion, and hire them from underrepresented groups. This is super, super hard. I don't need me to tell you that. And you are gonna face a lot of opposition. Someone will say like, oh yeah, sure, diversity is important, but we can't lower the bar. This bar is bullshit. It's a consensus that comes from a privileged position that has been held for a long time by the same majority of people who are part of the problem and not the solution. Last year, there was an internal study at Google, and it found that there is zero relationship between an interviewer saying hire and a candidate actually turning out to be a good hire or not. And this means that no one in tech has a bar that works very well in determining good versus bad hires at that stage, regardless of ethnicity or gender or any other diversity statistics. Hey, someone will say, not enough minorities are applying. We hear this all the time. So ask yourself why and then fix it. A good place to start, job descriptions, right? Leave out stuff like we are hiring node ninjas and we have beer pong. And yeah, sure, you have a long bullet point list and it feels natural, but you have to understand that that list implicitly selects for the majority, and the majority will apply when they meet a lower percentage of your criteria. It's like 60%. Minorities will only apply when they meet most, sometimes all, those criteria. So yeah, maybe you don't have job descriptions with bullet points for these very same reasons. Maybe you were more interested in someone's GitHub blog, open source contribution, someone's public speaking. How many single mom engineers do you think you'll hire with that approach? Very few. Our job is to build the best teams, and we can choose a lot of strategies to get there. But if that strategy is just going to be simply to hire the best candidate for the role, and it leaves you with a less diverse team and a weaker team, then your strategy is failing and it needs to change. You have to reach out to underrepresented groups. Can't just expect people to show up. You have to actively seek them out. If you're after women in tech, Twitter is full of us. You have to commit to supporting and nurturing people. And remember that minorities often have to prove themselves to a far greater extent than the majority. Studies show that men are promoted based on potential, and that women are promoted based on past achievement. So don't just hire people and let them get on with it. You have to have their backs, be their mentor, and if you can, be their sponsor. A sponsor is someone who advocates for you. You have to be there for them throughout their career and give them opportunity as they grow. And take the time to also give recognition. Use the platform you have, everyone has a platform, however small, to shout about the triumphs of minorities in tech. Become an ally. All of us can be allies for each other, no matter who you are. You just build up your empathy and your social intelligence, and you get comfortable with tampons and pronouns, and you learn the language used to describe disability, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, and this really matters to people. So if you don't know, just ask and listen, and become part of the solution by supporting minorities in the workforce and outside and at home. Be an equal parent or an equal partner. And leave no one out, no matter their gender, ability, race, or class. And notice, really see those who are around you. And even more importantly, look for those who are missing and should be around you. And treat everyone with the same respect and compassion and without prejudice. You have to actively and consciously build inclusive workplaces and inclusive conferences and inclusive panels and inclusive meetups and inclusive working groups. Use inclusive language, don't say guys. Code inclusive forums, leave the male, female, other awkward radio buttons out, and consider those who don't drink beer. Speak up. Silence serves no one. And especially speak up when others can. So step up for someone who needs you, because maybe they don't have the confidence, maybe they're not senior enough to demand that a problem be fixed. And don't be afraid to call out bad attitudes and behaviors. Do what you do if you weren't afraid, because we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us, and now it's on us to make the change possible. So you have to be bold, and you have to aim for the top, and that's scary. But as I get more senior, representation will be super important for me. And getting rid of any internal barriers is critical to gaining power and social impact, and it's entirely up to you to do it. Just be your true self and refuse to be someone you're not. And don't worry if you're uncomfortable. It's okay to be awkward. It's okay to feel little confidence. Breaking down these barriers inside you is super, super hard, but it helps create psychological safety for those around you, and those like you have the same struggles. And if you're a minority, don't just accept the status quo or get complacent. I have seen this in at least 4 Twitter bios, and it's, okay, I fit all your quotas, it's funny, but it's so unhelpful. Take responsibility for your words, especially as you get further in your career and gain more influence, because people will listen. So use that privilege to support and boost those who really need it. And you can help normalize allyship. If you're a person with privilege, it is much easier for you to advocate for allies. Yeah. Listen to people. Pay close attention to marginalized voices and give them your full attention, and don't interrupt, because everyone interrupts. Echo and attribute what you hear. And make sure you have access to a broad range of views. That might involve getting out of your comfort zone, making new connections, making new friends, or diversifying your social media and your social circles. You have to broaden your perspectives, but you have to do it with intention and compassion. And it's up to you to make the effort to get to know what others are going through. But whatever you do, don't make assumptions, because you're not the savior. A good place to start is maybe joining some support groups, or starting some support groups. Celebrate diversity. Make it an inclusive celebration for all of us in tech, and hold yourself and your team accountable to create this change. Because tolerating difference is not the same as embracing it. And if you're on Twitter, tweet my slide. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dora.